Okay, I think we're going to start, and then people will join us as they come on in. So, my name is Jay Goldman, and I'm going to talk to you today about a few different things. One of them, though, is this idea of survival of the fastest. We've all heard of survival of the fittest. It's been around for a long time. But the truth is that everything is accelerating. The rate of change itself is accelerating. And that has a lot to do with the tools and technologies and use of data that we're now able to do versus what we were able to do in the past. And it's turning into the company or the group that's able to evolve the fastest and execute the fastest is not only going to survive, but continue to thrive. So I'll start off with a little story. I'm not going to name the company. There's a hint on the screen. But when I started my job in the technology industry, working for a very, very, very big company, I was one of about 250,000 employees when I started. And I remember sitting down with my manager, who had been there for longer than I'd been alive when I started, and having a conversation about what the promotion outlook was like. You've all had this conversation. You've sat down and said, hey, things seem to be going pretty well. It was about the 6-month mark. And I said, what can I do to speed this up? You know, how do I get promoted faster? And he said, oh, you get promoted on your 1-year anniversary. What do you mean? He said, oh, everybody gets promoted on their 1-year anniversary, and then 2, and then 3. It takes about 5 years before you start to be promoted on your own merit. And that was the day I started looking for a new job. Because your high performers, the ones that we love, the ones that we want to enable and drive to be successful, are not going to stay in a job where they get promoted at the same rate as everybody else. The reason that they did that is because they had 250,000 people. How do you build HR programs that are highly individualized and personalized when you're trying to manage that many people? And the challenge is that the data didn't exist when that company, who's very big and very old, first started creating these. So they started doing things like salary bands and experience matrices and all the kinds of stuff that we actually hate. And in fact, short of there being any HR professionals in this room, everybody hates. In fact, I think HR professionals probably hate them too. But those things exist because it's impossible to personalize at scale unless you have big data and modern technology. The truth is that we have those things today. Today we can actually personalize them. To give you a sort of parallel example, I'm going to show you, let's rewind time a little bit here. And we'll go back to the 1960s. This is a real ad for Camel cigarettes. More doctors smoke Camel than any other brand. Now the doctors weren't smoking them because they were trying to kill Americans or recommending them because they were trying to do that. Actually, in the short term, smoking probably makes you feel better for a lot of things. But the truth is, the doctors at the time didn't have the data to know that smoking was actually really, really bad for you. And so they recommended this because Camels have a tea flavor zone or whatever it was that they liked about them. If you rewind a little bit further back, you get to another real ad, Radiator Toilets products, Radium and Beauty. This was literally radioactive beauty supplies. It did make your skin glow. Probably not in a good way. And again, nobody was being malicious here or trying to do bad things. They just didn't have the data. It had a short-term benefit. And if you go back even a little bit further to the early 19th or 20th century, Bayer Pharmaceuticals, heroin, the sedative for coughs. Real ad. Now, nobody here is going to take heroin because you have a cough or give it to your kids because they have a cough. This was also a child medication available for sedating your kids. Sometimes I wish that I could sedate my daughter, but probably heroin is the wrong way to go about doing that. So the truth is, nobody was going to take medical advice from this era, right? We're not going to go back and give our kids heroin, but we take management advice from exactly the same era. The way that most people run companies today was actually invented with the Industrial Revolution. A lot of those ideas and technologies, the things that we rely on, annual reviews, performance management, planning, that whole cycle was developed to manage very large companies in the industrial age. Gary Hamel, who many of you will be familiar with, kind of one of the leading thinkers on the management side. If you're not familiar with his work, I would highly recommend that you take a look at it, particularly the Management Innovation Exchange mix that he's been running with his team. So Gary makes the point that a lot of this stuff was invented at the turn of the 20th century, and it really hasn't fundamentally changed all that much. We're at a conference today about the future of work. The reality for most people is that work is exactly the same as it was about 100 years ago. We've just got slightly better tools. And the evolution of those tools in a lot of ways, to use another famous quote here, is really just a collection of faster horses. You think about email, which we all hate and we spend most of our day dealing with. Email is literally an office memo. The CC field in email is a carbon copy field. It comes from the office memo that had a carbon copy sheet in it. We have not evolved our technology nearly as quickly as our businesses has evolved. It's nice that it's in my pocket now, kind of, because it follows me around all day long, but it's basically fundamentally the same technology as it was when it was invented. So you think about companies like this, all companies that at one point we loved and are now almost entirely gone from our lives, RIM being kind of the holdout here. These companies knew about data. They knew how to use data. They used it, though, for things like optimizing their market share or making people buy more stuff from them. They didn't use it internally. They used it in the same way that we've been using data from when spreadsheets were manual things that we wrote down in a ledger book. So they used it to optimize the company's performance, but they didn't use it in the same way that these new titans of industry use data. You think about what makes these companies so interesting is that part of the way they use data, part of the reason why we love them so much, is that they personalize the experience for us. So Facebook uses data to curate your newsfeed and present you with stuff you're going to find interesting. Or Netflix uses it to make recommendations of movies and TV shows that you're going to love watching based on what you've loved in the past. It's a very different application of data than the traditional, how are our numbers doing or what are our KPIs? The question that we ask in the Decoded company is, what if companies understood their own people, their talent, better than they understand their customers? Think about almost every organization today, many of you work for organizations like this, expend a huge amount of time and effort trying to understand the marketplace. We do things like customer journey analysis, and we map how people are buying from us, and then we try to optimize the funnel. And even if we're doing this in a very modern way, we might do things like a marketing automation program where we're trying to optimize the funnel, but all of that is about external use. And the leverage of getting one person or one company to buy from us that wouldn't have bought from us before is not nearly as big as the leverage you can get by more deeply engaging your own people, come on in, by more deeply engaging your own people in the day-to-day of what they're doing. It's actually far more transformative to an organization to have a highly engaged team on board than it is to optimize one extra conversion point out of a funnel. So think about these companies again from that perspective. They're also all regularly on lists of great places to work with deeply engaged teams. This isn't an accident. The fact that they use that same technology internally is what engages those teams so richly in being there. It's also what allows them to be so successful in the market. In our personal lives, when we're interacting with those companies, we choose where we get these things from, and we have more choice than we've ever had before. If you don't want to stream something on Netflix, you can stream it on Amazon, and if you don't want to stream it there, you can stream it on iTunes. We have way more selection in our personal lives than we've ever had. There was a time when the better technology that we had in our lives was at work. You had a computer on your desk at work, you didn't have one at home, so your access to technology was really limited by the workplace. But as the technologies got better and we now all have smartphones in our pockets that are getting faster and faster and faster, those devices and the world of apps and everything else that we now have access to has meant that our technology in our personal lives is way better than it is at work. We hate the stuff we have to use at work. We love the stuff we get to use in our personal lives, and so we bring it with us to work, much to the chagrin of the IT departments that are left trying to support this, as we come to work with, you know what, if I can't get a file off the file server, I'll just put it in Dropbox. Super not secure, much easier. And so we've come to expect that. We've come to expect that technology really is helpful to us because in our personal lives, it's become incredibly helpful and it's getting more and more helpful every day. I don't know how many of you are iPhone users and have installed iOS 10. Hopefully it didn't break your phone. But if it didn't break your phone and you've had the experience of your phone telling you where you parked your car, it is a magical moment. It's a new feature in iOS 10. And as soon as your phone pops up an alert and says, hey, I marked where you parked your car for you, you go, oh my God, this is amazing. It's a small thing. But those are the things we've come to expect in our personal lives that we don't get from the technology that we have to use at work. This number will be familiar to this audience. This is the Gallup poll. It's an international study, hundreds of thousands of people in countries all over the world. 70% of people are disengaged at work. About 20–25% of those people are what they euphemistically called actively disengaged. Actively disengaged means they come into work every day intent on sabotaging the place that they work. That's a quarter of the workforce. So think about the company that you work for, even the colleagues on your immediate team. 70% disengagement among them, 25% who are like cancers inside those organizations, spreading negative energy and causing other people to become disengaged. This is actually one of the biggest challenges that we can tackle, I think, as humanity, because 70% disengagement in a firm that makes widgets means maybe the widgets aren't as good, but 70% disengagement in a team that's trying to fight cancer or solve big world problems is a much bigger challenge. And if we as humanity are going to be able to solve some of those, we need to figure out how to solve this problem. We don't have that disengagement in our personal lives because we have choice and because we work with the companies that understand us. But at work, it's a very different story. Everything about our world has changed fundamentally. You think of any one of these industries, from medicine to automotive to aerospace to computing in general. That's a picture at the top of what were called computers at the time. They were actually people doing manual tabulation. They were literally called computers. It's where the term comes from. And think about the difference between the top pictures and the bottom pictures in roughly the same period of time in which the technology of management has been in practice. So if you sort of think of it as how much has our workspace changed, right? This is a sort of typical office from the early 60s. This is kind of the same office these days, right? Not much is really all that different except that we've automated some of this stuff. So we sort of think of this as technology has evolved a tremendous amount, but the technology of management has not. And that's really what conferences like this and responsive organizations is all about. How do we evolve that technology of management so that it can start to keep pace with the technology that we use every day to get our jobs done? I'm going to pick on an example. It's an easy one to pick on because everybody hates it. How many people in this room love annual performance reviews? Right, nobody. Because they're terrible. And one of the reasons that they're terrible is what we call the recency bias. When you think about doing a review at the end of a year, this is kind of what you're really reviewing, right? The last sort of month, maybe a quarter's worth of stuff, because that's really all we can remember anyway. And so somebody sits down in front of us and we have to do their review, and we're really thinking about what they accomplished most recently. It's only one of many reasons why performance reviews are terrible. There's no reason why we do them on an annual cycle other than that we plant crops on an annual cycle, and all of this comes from when we were an agrarian society and everything followed an annual planting cycle. That's the reason we do annual reviews the way that we do them. It's kind of ridiculous when you think about it that way. The truth about them is 97.2% of US companies do them, 98% of staff find them unnecessary, and 58% of the people who actually run the process think that they suck as well. Why are we still doing this? Because the technology of management hasn't changed. There hasn't been a better way to solve this particular problem. Except we think that there is, because there's so much data about performance these days. The digital body language of people in an organization is huge. If you just look at their interactions with their peers through things like email or Slack or instant message or how they're participating in projects or using the different resources available, you can actually collect together a huge amount of data about somebody's performance. And these days, with modern big data analysis and machine learning, it's pretty easy to analyze all that data and come to some automated conclusions. It's not to say that we're going to replace human judgment ever. That's still the absolutely important factor here. But what if, as a manager, instead of sitting down with somebody and thinking about their last month, you could have an automated report that gives you a whole perspective on their, even if you're going to continue to do them manually, on their last 12 months worth of performance. All of that's possible today with the technology we have. We just need to evolve the way that we think about managing people. To quantify why this is important, this graph shows you the average tenure on the S&P 500 since 1958 and projected out over sort of the next 20 years or so. This should be a terrifying graph if you believe in things remaining that they are. Now, nobody in this audience does. That's why we're all at this conference together. But if you think about what it means for the tenure to be getting shorter and shorter and shorter, it's that the rate of disruption and change is getting faster. That's not just in things like business models. Yes, Uber is disrupting a very established transportation industry because they have a new model, but it's also because the way that people want to work is changing, and the way that they engage with work is changing, and our need to evolve all of that has to keep pace with this, otherwise we become dinosaurs that get left behind. So when we think about part of the challenge, think about something like process. In an organization today, we often have standard operating procedures. They're the way that we do things, right? You join a new company, and you have 3 weeks of mandatory training at the beginning, and part of that is just teaching you the process. When you start doing it, it goes here, and then we have a decision, and there's some workflow approvals and all that kind of stuff. But the thing is, not everybody going through this process needs to follow the whole process from beginning to end. Yes, that person just joining the company should probably go through it from beginning to end with all the right guardrails and safety checks and everything in place. That's risk management. But does somebody doing it for the 100th time have to go through the same set of things? Or could we speed the process up knowing that they know what they're doing? So instead of it looking like this, could we say that it looks like that for that new person, and there are some teachable moments there where we're going to stop them from going forward before they complete a just-in-time training delivery, and we can do that because we have all the right data about that person and we know they've never done this step of the process before. Let's intervene and give them training just when they need it, instead of forcing them through that really terrible 3 weeks of training when you join the job. But then let's start taking those checks out of the way, so when we get to our most experienced person, they can go as fast as possible without having to follow all of those guardrails. This is a really different way of thinking about this than the traditional approach has been, and this is where the companies who are surviving in that previous chart are able to survive and thrive at a much faster rate. You bring it back to sort of personal example. When was the last time you wrote down step-by-step directions to get anywhere? Even here, which was actually a little bit challenging to navigate, right? You didn't start writing down directions because somebody told you to drive to here and then turn right when you got to this thing and whatever. You just put it into a GPS. You don't have to think about what's actually happening behind the scenes, but process the way that we're sort of envisioning it is very similar to this. You don't have to worry about what happens behind the scenes. There's a lot of intelligence that goes into this routing, especially now that we're starting to layer things like traffic information and road closures and other things into this. You don't have to care. Waze is just going to tell you the best way to get wherever it is that you're going, even if there's a huge amount of computational work going on in the background. Why can't process inside of an organization be just as easy as this? Help me get to the destination that I'm going through, analyze all the data that's available, provide training at exactly the right moments to help me accomplish that, and coach me to a better outcome than I would have got to on my own. So I'll give you an example to sort of make this tangible. Ferrari for many years dominated F1 racing. And they dominated it not just because they build really good cars and they have the budget to hire really good drivers, that certainly helps. But for many years, they dominated it because they were the first team to build one of these. This is a sensing and actuating center. It reads in real time thousands and thousands and thousands of telemetry points on the car, which are fed back to a team for analysis. No matter how good you've planned out the race from a race perspective, there's going to be reality along the way, and it's going to hit you in the face, and things are going to change. Somebody's going to blow a tire out, and now there's tire debris all over the course. It's going to start raining. There's an oil slick. Doesn't matter what it is, the ability to analyze those thousands and thousands of points in real time and have this team able to whisper in the driver's ear and coach them to a better level of performance is what helped Ferrari to be dominant. In fact, they hid this center for a long time because they didn't want the other teams to figure out what it was that was helping them to achieve such greater success. Now, at this point, everybody has sensing and actuating centers, and telemetry is a standard part of leading a race team. Luckily for us in our businesses, we don't have to make such rapid decisions as you have to make as an F1 driver, but none of us really have sensing and actuating centers, even if our businesses operate at a slightly slower pace than an F1 race. Think about how powerful it would be if everyone in your organization had a coach whispering in their ear in real time, analyzing all the data about the business and providing those moments of coaching when reality hits you in the face. So in the Decoded company, we talk about three principles of being decoded that have really come about as a rate of the change of technology and our access to creative applications of data. The first is tech as a coach. Ferrari's example is a good example of that, and I'll give you another one in a moment. The second is data as a sixth sense. How do you really equip everyone in your organization to be able to use data as a sixth sense to help them when they're making decisions? How do you get to faster, better decisions? And the last one is what we call engineered ecosystems, which is really, to some degree, what a conference like today, the future of work, is all about. How do you intentionally engineer the ecosystem of your organization? Move away from an organic evolution to something that you're much more intentional about, where you actually take the time to think through things about how people progress and develop and are engaged. So let me walk you through those and give you a couple of examples. The first one I'll give you is a Tech as a Coach example from UPS. Not necessarily a company that comes to mind immediately as being radically innovative with the use of technology. But in this case, actually, they undertook a particular project which at the time was so radical that it led to a mass rejection from their staff. We all know about this. This is organizational antibodies descending on innovation and preventing it from actually being achievable as an organization. The challenge that UPS was facing is that reality in the outside world was getting more and more complex. They had more packages to deliver. It was harder to navigate traffic. Their driver shifts were getting longer and longer. There were more accidents. The cost of fuel was going up. And so they stepped back and said, how do we solve this with data and technology? And they had a team do a whole bunch of research. They produced what turned out to be about 80 pages of math to come up with an algorithm that could do a better job of routing their trucks in real time using full situational awareness, live traffic data, all that kind of stuff. And it manifested, the project was called Orion, and it manifested in either a heads-up display or a handheld display for the drivers that would tell them the route that they should take to deliver their packages. And the drivers immediately rejected this completely. They said, there's no way I'm following a computer around. I know my routes better than they do. I'm going to be way faster at delivering these. And so UPS did something actually very clever when it came to adoption. And this is one of the biggest questions we get, is how do you actually get people to adopt this and affect change in your organization? You can think about this as how do we force change on them, or you can think about this as how do we get buy-in to the change that we want to deliver. So in the case of UPS, they said, okay, we're going to demonstrate as an experiment that we think that this is a better solution. So we're going to divide you guys up into 3 groups. The group over here, you guys just keep doing exactly what you've always been doing. Keep driving the same routes, keep delivering your packages, and we're just going to look at how you perform at doing that. The group in the middle over here, we're going to say, don't worry at all about using this system unless you think it's going to be helpful. So when it gives you recommendations, you should listen to them if you think that they're important, but if you want to override them, then you should absolutely override them. And the group over here, we're going to say, just do exactly what Orion tells you to do, just for the purpose of this experiment. Let's see if it's actually better. So our 3 groups were, do what you've always done except if you think Orion is helpful, or just do what Orion tells you to do. And it's probably no big surprise that it was the group in the middle that really outperformed the others by a significant amount. That pairing of analytics with instincts was way better at performance than either of the other groups because it gave you full situational awareness but allowed you to override it if you thought that your visibility into the situation was better, right? Just because the traffic information says this street is moving really well doesn't take into account that an accident has just happened in front of you and now it's not moving so well anymore. And so that pairing of instincts and analytics is what really allowed them to achieve a far greater success. It also taught them some really interesting and sort of surprising things. One of them was that left turns are a really, really bad thing for their business for 2 reasons. One, most accidents happen during left turns, so their drivers could be far safer if they avoided making left turns, but also idling while waiting to make a left turn burned a whole bunch of fuel. So they could make the trucks far more efficient by making more right turns instead of waiting to make a single left turn. And so the automated routing actually avoids left turns whenever possible. So an example of technology as a coach. The data as a sixth sense is an interesting one because we all use data today in our businesses. It is, to that slide that had Borders and Kodak and everyone on it, often externally facing data that doesn't necessarily help us to achieve a better performance for our teams, but it does help us to understand the world. Whole Foods is a good example of a company that's doing a blended approach to both of those things. They use a huge amount of data internally to help them understand the marketplace, and of course, that helps them understand what's selling and not selling, and do they have the right assortment and pricing and all that kind of stuff. But what you might not know is that they share a huge amount of data about what's happening inside of the organization. Very early in Whole Foods' life, their CEO got tired of people coming to him who had just learned, for example, that one of their colleagues made more money than they did, and wanting to know why that person did or didn't make more money, that they decided to go with the radical transparency step of full disclosure of compensation information. So they have an internal system, and you can look up anybody in the company and see exactly how much money they make, including the CEO. The reason they went to that step is it took the power asymmetry of that data out of the hands of people who could use it to their own advantage. And it distributed it to everybody in the organization. So now that conversation isn't how much does this person make, but I'd like to understand why this person makes more money than I do. And now it gives managers the opportunity to have a conversation about, well, actually it's because of this, this, and this, and if you're able to achieve those things, then we'll happily pay you the same amount or even more than that person does. It changed the tone of those conversations from a jealousy conversation to a how do I improve conversation. But they also share a huge amount of data with their store managers. All of their stores actually run fairly autonomously. They have all their own hiring decisions internally that they can make, and they share a packet of information on a weekly basis with every store manager, not just about how their store is doing, but also about how every other store at Whole Foods is doing and how they can leverage that data to perform better for themselves. So that radical openness and transparency is a big factor in why they've been able to be so successful. The last example I'll give you for engineered ecosystems is an example from the video gaming world. I don't know how many of you are gaming fans, but if you are, you probably know of Valve, and if you're not a gaming fan, you've probably never heard of them. Valve is actually a $5 billion company, but outside of the gaming world, they're not that well known. They've produced some of the best-selling gaming titles in history, and they have a very, very crazy approach to how they run their organization. They are a completely flat company. There is no hierarchy to the company at all. In fact, if you look at their org chart, it is actually just a straight line, and everybody appears at some point on that straight line. Now, they published online, and it's easy to find if you're looking for it, their employee handbook. It's actually the handbook that goes to new employees when they join the Valve team. And part of it explains this approach to flatness, but part of it explains how they decide what people are going to work on. You actually have full autonomy at Valve to make that decision for yourself. This is a radical ecosystem approach. Your desk at Valve is literally on wheels. It's designed so that, because they're a gaming company, less laptops, more sort of very powerful desktops, but it's designed so that you have to plug two things in, an Ethernet cable and a power cable. And so you can choose what you want to work on, and you just wheel your desk over to the project team that you want to join, and you plug in and join the project team. And then if you're not finding that you're adding value to it or you're not a valuable member of the team, you can wheel your desk over to another team and join their project. And if you don't find a project that you want to work on, that's probably a good sign that you should start your own project team. And so you now have to convince other people to join your project. And that's how the entire organization is actually run. But you have to be very careful with where you choose to join, because at the end of every project, they do a ranking by the whole project team of who contributed to the project. So you can't just wheel up and join a team and hope for the best. You actually have to be a valuable member of the team, or you should wheel your desk over to somebody else's project and join theirs. Now, I'm not recommending that this is an approach that everyone should run out on, Thursday morning and try back at their company. It's pretty far out there. But to us, it's a really good example of a company that is using data to engineer an ecosystem that rewards really high-performing team members with exactly what they're looking for. If you think back to Dan Pink's drive, this is really mastery, autonomy, and purpose implemented in the best working example that we've been able to find. And that really contributes to a very, very high level of engagement. Valve attracts very high levels of talent, and doesn't lose very many of them because it's almost impossible to find a working condition that's similar to that. So Klick as a business, the company that I work for, is in the health space. And we spend a lot of time working with biotech and biopharma companies. And one of the things that is really remarkable about our industry compared to almost every other industry out there is that this is what the product development cycle looks like from beginning to end. What you're looking at here is typically 10 to 15 years worth of work. It will often cost north of $1 billion by the time that drug actually makes it to market. You'll go from the left edge here, the pre-discovery phase, maybe 10,000 possible compounds that could turn into a drug. And if you're very, 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 very lucky, at the end of that $1 billion and 10 to 15 years, you'll have a single FDA-approved drug on the market. So think about what happens when you can go faster in this process. There's so many variables here that are impossible to control. Will a drug be efficacious and safe for people to take? Will it actually accomplish what you're trying to do? Will it do anything? Because most of those compounds will turn out to actually do nothing. Can you raise enough money to sustain this? Most drug companies, by the time they launch their first drug, have already been public for a number of years with absolutely no revenue. It's probably the only industry in the world where that's actually possible. So what's at stake here beyond sort of the obvious question? The truth is, if you think about getting a drug to market, let's say you're working on a new oncology treatment for a rare form of cancer, and there is no treatment on market today for that rare form of cancer, and you're able to produce a drug that extends patients' lives by 5 years. Think about the impact that that drug has on those patients. This is really, to us, where the tangible example of why it's so important for us to make work happen faster, to evolve and execute faster, comes to bear. Because it's not just about the money, although it is about that, and I'll show you that slide in a second. But think about what happens if you bring that drug to market a year earlier. How many more people's lives were extended by 5 years because the drug was there? How many more birthdays did they get with their kids because you were able to deliver that drug to them? It has a huge cost to the world to be able to engage your people, to reduce that 70% and have them engaged in moving faster. Now, it also has a financial side to it. At a drug that's going to be a blockbuster drug that's going to do $1 billion a year worth of sales, a day's delay is $3 million worth of revenue. So yes, there's a financial cost to this as well, and not getting that drug to market does make a big difference to the bottom line. But really, it's that human piece of it that's one of the biggest challenges. So part of where all of this actually comes to bear, for those of you who work for very big companies who are struggling with the question of innovation, the innovator's dilemma, how do we continue to fuel the innovation that got us to where we are today, or for those of you working for smaller companies that are on your way to becoming victims of the innovator's dilemma, part of the challenge, the sort of one of the myths that we come across on a regular basis, especially when we talk about the future of how to do this stuff, we have lots of companies come to us on a regular basis and say, help us be more innovative. We've lost our ability to innovate. We want to know how we should restructure for innovation, or which headcount we should hire for innovation. And this is a good myth to debunk because the reality is you can't do either one of those things. You can move people around the org chart as much as you'd like, and you can hire people in and tell them that their mandate is innovation, but unless you have a culture that delivers that, unless you have an engaged culture of people who are constantly pushing that forward, innovation isn't going to happen in your organization. You can try all kinds of different things. You can outsource this to a consultancy. There's lots of innovation consultancies out there that will tell you that they're going to do this, and while you're engaged with them, yes, innovation will happen. As soon as they disappear, innovation will stop. You can say, we're going to create an independent off-site innovation group, and we're going to tell them that they have to do innovation. This is the group that gets things like, your KPI is 4 innovations a quarter. What does that even mean? What are the 4 innovations that I'm delivering? Which part of the business am I innovating on? How are we measuring an innovation? None of that's important. I can say on our annual report that we have an innovation group, and so that's the important thing. Or you can work with a signature technology provider. This is where IBM's Watson or Apple or some of the other vendors come into play, and they come in to help you deliver innovation. But this doesn't actually work either because it's all outsourced innovation. And so your people aren't learning anything, and it's not engaging them anymore. It's really just driving revenue towards that outsourced provider. So there's lots of variations of this. You can have different brands work with different ones. You can create an innovation group that becomes the front end to that. You can have an innovation accelerator that helps all of these different groups to accelerate. The bottom line with innovation, and the reason that we talk about it in this context, is because this is where the future is supposed to happen. And in a discussion like we're having today about the future of work, innovation in the way that we work is more important than the innovation in our product development cycle. It's more important than the features that we're able to add to our products. It's really the crux of the issue. If we can innovate our own companies, if we can turn that data lens inward and change the way that we look at our people and understand them and use that data to drive different models of engaging our people, then outside innovation in our products will happen on its own. That part will take care of itself. But when we talk about innovation in most companies, we actually mean this stuff. How do we make our products have more market share? That's not innovation, that's just product development. We have to turn that lens inside our companies and innovate in the way that we think about engaging our own people. The second myth that we get all the time is, what is going to be the future? And this is an impossible question to answer. If you had asked people before smartphones and tablets came out about the future, they would have been completely wrong because none of them would have seen that coming, and so that wouldn't have been part of what they anticipated. And that applies just as much to the future of work as it does to product development, because the future of work has become completely mobile in a way that we couldn't have anticipated before the smartphone revolution happened. I was talking to some colleagues the other day, and we were talking about autonomous cars and eventually autonomous airplanes and boats and all that kind of stuff. And it occurred to us that every science fiction movie ever has got this wrong because there are still pilots in the ships. There won't be pilots in the ships. Han Solo won't pilot the Millennium Falcon, although that happened a long time ago, so I guess that was in the past. But all of these sci-fi movies where the pilot jumps into the cockpit of the ship are wrong. There won't be a cockpit of the ship because we're already almost at the point of autonomous cars. So the future certainly doesn't include spaceships that we have to pilot on our own. And I think that's a sort of good example of the myth of the crystal ball. Robert Zemeckis was asked about Back to the Future, what's the one thing they got wrong about the future, and he said cell phones. In fact, if you watch the movie again, there are no cell phones in it, there are still payphone booths, even though there are flying cars, right? That's a good example of how we miss this stuff. So when we think about innovation, in most cases today, we think about a whole stack of technologies, this is what we can do today, and then some of them are converging together, and then what business problem are we going to solve? This is completely backwards, because we're trying to find problems that these solutions can solve for us. And that applies to how we organize our people and how we engage them as well, when we think about things like, oh, mobile as a sensor. How do we use that to solve our market share problem? This is the wrong way around. If you think about this the other way, if you start on this end and you say, what are the business problems that we have? And then you think about where we want to be able to play, and then you work backwards to what are the technology solutions that can enable us, whether we're talking about product development or whether we're talking about the future of how our people engage in our businesses, you get to a 10x return on that. And a 10x return is not a small return, right? If you think about that as an exponential return over what you were going to achieve before, Ray Kurzweil talks about the best way to understand exponential returns is to think about what would happen if I took 30 steps across this stage. In linear steps, I would end up on the other side of the stage. If they were 30 exponential steps, I would be on the moon. That's the difference between a 1x return and a 10x return. So the way that we kind of take all of this back and think about how to apply this within our organizations today is that, and this doesn't matter what type of innovation we're talking about, but it really is actually directly relevant to the question of how do we evolve our businesses forward in how we engage our people and how we create that future of work within our own organizations. You have to start on the left here. There's some basics. This is an execution question that have to be fixed. They are the foundation. You can't build a house on a shaky foundation. You can't evolve your business if those basics aren't in place today. And then you need to think about a series of experiments that drive that business forward, that help to answer questions like how do we engage our people, how do we transform the work that we're doing, and then you can get to that long-term 10x disruption that we all want to get to. Unfortunately, there's no shortcuts in this slide. You really do have to progress through this. So think about Amazon as an example of a business, that's been especially effective at doing this. When Jeff Bezos wrote his Dear Shareholders letter when they were going public, it's one of the best shareholder letters I've ever seen. It's not that dissimilar to Google's letter to their shareholders or Mark Zuckerberg's letter. It basically says, if you want to come along for the ride, come along for the ride, but you get absolutely no control and no decision making. And he did that because it allowed them to do things that were radically different than other businesses would, internally in how they structure themselves, externally in the products that they delivered to their market. Think about where they were when he wrote that letter, and they were just at the beginning of that e-commerce journey. Think about what their 10x long-term evolutionary advantage has turned out to be. Amazon, I heard it recently described as a data center with a gift shop, because that's what their business has become. 100% of their profit, or close to these days, changing slightly now, is driven by Amazon Web Services. It's not the store. The store is a value add on top of that. They would never have gotten to that if they had started off with the question of how do we evolve in a way that's going to deliver value to our customers. And the same thing is true when we're trying to change our businesses internally. You can never get to an unexpected outcome like that if you're trying to take linear steps in that direction. But the experiments that they ran in between, with AWS, the particular experiment was how do we automate our own processes to make it faster for our development teams who are building products to launch those products to market, and then the realization that they could take that set of automation and make it available to external people was what gave them that now 10x evolutionary advantage. So a good way to understand all of this, if you haven't come across it before, Singularity's 6Ds framework, and we'll take you through those really quickly to sort of give you a sense of how those play out. A great example of deceptive is actually the 10x return, the exponential steps versus linear steps. Sometimes this stuff is really deceptive in that we don't really understand the impact it's going to have until we've played it all the way through. It's impossible to look at this stuff and decide in advance of running experiments what's going to happen. Steve Blank, in talking about 4 steps to the epiphany, how to build startups, has a great line that we use all the time ourselves at Klick. Inside the building, there are only opinions. Outside the building, there are facts. You as a team can't make decisions about how things are going to come out until you've gone and engaged the actual people that are going to either use your product or your team who need to be engaged in the work that they're doing. And so this is really about getting to that outcome and not falling prey to the deceptiveness of where you think it's going to come along the way. Disruption, we don't sort of need to explain that in the context of the conversation we're having today, but one example that we use all the time here, Kodak actually invented digital cameras, but they shelved it because it disrupted their film business. They didn't want to disrupt themselves, so although they actually could have owned the digital camera revolution, that is actually a picture of the first digital camera that they developed, they put it on the shelf and didn't market it as a technology. You could also draw an example of Xerox and their work at Park, which ultimately led to graphical user interfaces in computers, but was too disruptive to the photocopier business for them to exploit it as a technology. In the end, you can say that they were disrupted by Instagram. They were obviously disrupted by more than just Instagram. But at the time, Instagram had about 50 employees, and they effectively disrupted a multi-billion-dollar global company. This is the rate of change accelerating, but also the leverage that we can get to be disruptive when we rely on digital technologies. A lot of this stuff is being digitized as well. So some of the examples of new sensors that are available on the market today, I love this video because it shows really visually exactly what has happened over the last sort of 30 years. And many of us had a desk that looked like that back in the 80s, and then gradually pretty much everything on our desk has turned into an app on our phone or on our laptop until we're pretty much just left with the phone and the laptop. And that is a great example of the rate of digitization. It's also a great example of the future of work. This is only going to become more and more true as we continue to evolve. Eventually, the smartphone will disappear as well, and it will be replaced by other wearables and probably implantables and whatever else we're going to call them when we get there. But this is all changing at an incredible rate. And so the way that we look at this stuff is how do we digitize what in the past might have been an offline process, but how do we automate it? How do we digitize our process so that it's adaptive to the people who are running the process, as we talked about earlier? You think about dematerialization from the actual physical tangible, like record labels who thought that they were in the business of making CDs. They were actually in the business of distributing music, but they lost sight of that key thing that their value was in distributing music to listeners, not in actual distribution of physical product. And that obsession with the physical product allowed for Napster to exist. And the way that everybody responds to dematerialization, watch the taxi industry doing it right now with Uber, is to try to get legislation involved. They try to get it blocked through legislation. This never works, of course, because legislation is to serve the people, and the people's interest is actually in the stuff being dematerialized. But this is the way that established industries always respond to this challenge, and we'll watch this happen inside of our organizations when you bring in new innovative ways to work or to evolve the way that you engage your people. Those organizational antibodies effectively do the same thing. They look for legislation internally to try to block the progress of something. It never actually works in the long run. It just slows things down. But that's what's going to happen as we try to innovate the workplaces that we're in as well. Other good examples of, in the healthcare space, of dematerialization, things like highly personalized prosthetic devices, moving away from the sort of established market of building one-off prosthetics that satisfy everybody to things like actually scanning your limbs and 3D printing things. 3D printing as a technology on the whole, really pushing a lot of this stuff forward. This is actually the FDA, or a press release issued by the company of the FDA approving the first 3D printed pill product. And if you extend that technology out and think about drug delivery as a mechanism, today you go to your doctor, they write you a script, you go to a pharmacy, they put pills into a package and they give it to you. What happens to that entire industry when you put that script digitally into a printer that's in your house and it prints out the drug for you and you don't actually have to go anywhere? This is dematerialization brought to a very real place for all of us from a health perspective. Demonetization is really about how the established economics of an industry are changing over time. We see this happen in a lot of different places. One really good example is the X Prize, started by Peter Diamandis and a few other folks. This is really the moonshot, how do we fund the 10x change in technology. This is one of them, the Qualcomm Tricorder Prize. This particular prize is, I don't remember actually how much it is, but it will be given, hopefully at some point, to whoever can invent a technology that can diagnose a patient as well or better than a group of board-certified physicians can. So how do you really push sensor technology and artificial intelligence to its absolute limits? And this is similar to the way that lots of technologies in the past, right down actually to the ability to navigate at sea, have all been created through the generous donation of prize money to people who are going to be able to do that. This is demonetization because it completely changes the economics of doing what would otherwise be very costly research. You saw the X Prize happen as well with reusable spacecraft. That's where a number of different spacecraft companies came from, often funded by technology billionaires, who were all working towards something that would have been basically impossible without that demonetization of the space industry to move the funding source somewhere else. And then lastly, democratization. This is Google's Loon balloon. I don't know how many of you have come across this, but this is a result of Google's own moonshot group who have come up with a way of delivering internet access anywhere in the world. These are giant autonomous helium balloons that float in the atmosphere, and they connect through technology down to a receiver dish, which you can put on your house or your business or whatever else, and you get very, very high-speed internet access. But there's no need for somebody to oversee the system. The balloons actually control themselves. They know how to go up and down in the atmosphere. They know how to sort of plot the wind currents and follow them along. The system as a whole delivers internet access. And technologies like this, or Facebook's satellite that unfortunately was lost in the launch the other day, are all about how you democratize access to things. So this happens inside of our own organizations as well. You don't have to float helium balloons or launch satellites. But democratization of access to data, like we saw in the Whole Foods example of opening up data throughout the organization and giving open access to it as a decision-making tool, is an incredibly powerful way to democratize decision-making. And so this particular D can have a huge impact inside of organizations as well by opening up access to things that were traditionally closed or limited. So sort of parting thought is to really think about the thinking that has brought you to where you are today as an organization and individually. A lot of these changes happen because people reject the status quo of how things have always been done, challenge it, and radically change it because they question the actual thinking that's brought us to that point. Einstein said that if we continue to use the same thinking that created problems, we can never solve them. You have to approach them from a different perspective. And so one of the things we challenge people to do is think about the actual thinking that has led you to get to that point, and really allows you to unleash your exponential advantage inside of your organizations as you push forward a mandate of changing the future of work. Thank you. We have a little bit of time for questions if anybody has them. Yeah. Yeah, how are we applying some of this in our current projects? So we have built a system internally at Klick, and that we actually have now made available for companies outside of Klick that want to use it. And it takes a lot of these ideas and makes them very real to the people on our team. So James actually joined us about a month ago, and his onboarding experience at Klick was completely different than anywhere else that he's ever worked before, because we've taken a lot of these ideas and applied them to something as simple as the question of how do you onboard people effectively into an organization. Onboarding in most organizations is an afterthought. You show up to the first day at work, and then somebody looks at you with a surprised look on their face and says, oh, it's your first day today. Okay, we're going to find you a desk to sit at, and I'm going to see if we have an extra laptop that you can use. And that's most people's experience of onboarding. Or you have the opposite extreme, like I had at the very large company, where you're into a mandatory 3-week training program that's not personalized at all and is boring as hell, and that's your welcome to this new organization that you're part of. So we've taken a very different approach where we use as much data as we have available to personalize that experience of onboarding. It's different depending on the team that you're joining and the role that you're coming into and your level of experience. We've automated through process automation all of the steps that need to happen in order to have a successful onboarding. It turns out actually in our organization, and I think probably true in most, there's about 100 different things that have to happen for somebody to have a successful start at our organization, from the pure logistics things like there needs to be a desk and a laptop and all that kind of stuff, to what we think of as cultural onboarding. So logistical onboarding is actually in a way easier to accomplish. The cultural side of things is what typically gets left behind. And for us, the cultural piece is how do we start to mesh them into the social framework of our organization as quickly as possible? We know from lots of evidence out there, there's lots of great academic study of this, that the more social connections you have at work, the more engaged you'll be, and the longer that you'll stay in your role. So how do we start to mesh those social connections as early as possible is an onboarding question to us. We hire lots of technology folks who tend towards the introverted end of the spectrum. For them, it's maybe not as easy or as desirable for them to put themselves out there and start to form those social connections on their own. So we've automated parts of that at key points in that onboarding. For example, everybody who starts in our organization has a peer buddy nominated to be their buddy. That's not that unusual, but we do things like every peer buddy gets a Starbucks gift card so that they can take the new person out for a coffee in their first week. And the Starbucks gift card has enough balance on it that when they give it to that new person, they can now take a few other people out for coffee on the cart. So we've started to sort of grease the wheels of how they're going to form those connections. They also get on their first day what we call rookie cookies. It's a box of cookies that you get handed right on your first day, right at the beginning of your day, freshly baked. And you make a post to our internal social network and you say, hi, I'm Jay, it's my first day here, and I have fresh cookies at my desk, which causes people to come to your desk to have cookies, and then you get to introduce yourself to them, and now you form connections with those people. That's great from a cultural perspective. That one has a logistical side as well. How do you make sure that there are enough boxes of cookies for all the people who are starting on the right day and that they're there when they come in? So all of these systems play together to turn these things into very easy to execute but highly influential steps in that process. Yeah?
What are you seeing as some of the viable alternatives to performance reviews? A lot of companies are leaving the annual review.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. So what are viable alternatives to performance reviews? There's been a lot of articles that have come out recently about big companies moving away from performance reviews, and the thing I love about them is all of the articles basically say, we have no idea what we're going to do instead, but we're abandoning performance reviews. And I think there's still much rejoicing in the hallways because everybody hates them even if we don't know where we're going to. From our perspective, there are a bunch of challenges that make performance reviews terrible, and I think in looking at the challenges, you start to find alternatives. So we talked about recency bias. The problem with recency bias, obviously, is that humans are fallible and our memories are short, so relying on us to remember what somebody's done is a terrible way to do this. And the simple answer to that question is have feedback sessions more often. It seems obvious, but the truth is, if you sit down for regular one-on-ones and you use any form of tool, including a notebook and a pen, that allow you to document the conversation that happens in those one-on-ones, let's say that you do that every 2 weeks, you have now maybe 25 data points from across the year that you can rely on to help overcome something like recency bias. So that's one part of it. The truth is also that those regular feedback sessions will result in much higher performance. We talk about in the Decoded company what we call the rule of 5 degrees. 5 degrees is a simple rule. If you're on a boat and you set out from harbor and you're 5 degrees off course, if you make a course correction early, it's a very small course correction. If you wait until you're on the other side of the lake to make it, it's a huge course correction because it's magnified by that entire time that you were traveling in the wrong direction. So having a regular check-in, like a one-on-one session between a leader and somebody who reports to them, allows you to make those constant little course corrections, but also accumulates a whole bunch of data. Part of the reason that we do annual performance reviews is because they're tied to the compensation cycle. So when we're going to do an annual raise cycle, we have to do an annual performance review because we have to justify whether we're giving you a raise or not giving you a raise. And the problem is, aside from the fact that we probably shouldn't be doing that on an annual cycle anyway, tying it to compensation makes it a much more difficult conversation to have about actual performance. Let's say I have 10 people reporting to me and I'm given a raise pool of $10,000. Well, as a leader, I now have a decision to make which forces me to weigh one person over another person. I can give the whole $10,000 to James. I'm sure he'd be very happy about that. The rest of the team, probably not so much. I can give $1,000 to everybody. But the truth is, I'm making trade-off decisions that aren't based on actual performance. And now when I sit down with them for their annual review, I can't give them feedback that doesn't align to what I'm giving them for a raise. So if I gave everybody $1,000 each, I have to basically tell them that they were pretty mediocre throughout the year. If I gave it to $10,000 to one rock star, I have to tell everybody else that they were terrible. Otherwise, the compensation and the feedback aren't tied together, and now that cognitive dissonance causes problems. So one of the big answers is stop tying the annual review from a performance basis to a compensation conversation. You still have to have both, but doing them at the same time means the feedback isn't real feedback, it's feedback in pursuit of justifying the compensation piece. So that's sort of one of the answers to it. What we're moving towards, both as a company and as a platform, is the idea that everybody has an annual date, which is their anniversary date of starting in the company. And that anniversary date is an opportunity for reflection based on the performance that you've had over the last 12 months, what you've been able to achieve individually, rather than an opportunity to talk about whether you should have a raise or not have a raise. So we know that we have so much data available to us now that we can actually automate the curation of essentially a yearbook for every person in our company, which can be done on a completely automated basis. So we're evolving towards a tool set that will allow the system to produce a yearbook beautifully designed and laid out. It will go in advance of that anniversary date to every leader in our organization for them to be able to review and provide commentary on and add thoughts and comments and that kind of stuff. It will actually go to press and become a tangible physical yearbook. And on your anniversary date, you'll sit down with your manager and you'll have a moment of reflection on what the last 12 months meant to you as an individual and to the business and your contribution to it. And that's a true moment of reflection rather than us having an arbitrary conversation that's forced around compensation or the last 3 months of performance. It will be separated from compensation because we do an annual raise cycle for the whole organization rather than you having that conversation at an artificial time in your own timeline. And to us, that is a much more effective annual event than the traditional performance review is. It will never take the place of all the one-on-ones that you do with your leader throughout the year and those little course corrections that you need to make, but it will mark the passage of time in a way that really gets true reflection on the value that you've added to the organization. I'm going to take one more, but I'm around for the rest of today and tomorrow if anybody else has any questions. How do we capture the data to? Objective data. So we talk in the book about 2 types of data that occurs in organizations. There's probably more, but in 2 broad groups. You have what's sort of biased data that people have put into systems, and you should assume that any time that anybody is putting self-reported data into a system, it has bias. Sometimes that bias is intentional, sometimes the bias is unintentional, but it always has a bias on it because we're humans and that's the way our brains work. It's the same way that if you ask 2 people who were part of an event to recall the event, their recollections will be different because they filtered it through their own understanding and their own thought process. So all self-reported data is biased, non-objectionable, and so relying on self-reported data for things like performance reviews is not an objective conversation about performance. The other type of data, though, is ambient data. This is the data that exists in a system just by virtue of using the system. It's unbiased because it's sort of the digital exhaust or the digital body language of us interacting with that system. If you think about something as simple as email, email itself has a whole bunch of information about it which is ambient. There's information about who I email and how often, and there's information about the length of those emails, and does it change depending on our relationship with each other. There's information, if you tie that into other communication systems, about how often you use different communication systems with different people inside your organization. Do I IM James on a regular basis, or do I email him, or do I phone him? How often are we in meetings together? That's ambient data that exists in the calendaring system. There's a huge amount of ambient data in our organizations today, and we don't really tap into any of it except if we're getting audited for something. But if you use that data proactively, you can actually come to very objectionable decisions about what's happening in an organization that's completely different than the self-reported data. I will just say on the self-reported data side, the more self-reported data you collect about something, the more you can even out individual bias. So you can actually get to objectionable self-reported data if you can step back far enough and get enough of it to be able to analyze it as a large set. But it's the individual sort of one-off pieces that make it much harder to get to that answer. So I'm around if anybody has any questions. We will actually have copies of the Decoded Company tomorrow if anybody would like one. I think they're going to be up at the front desk when you come in the morning, so grab a copy while they're there. But feel free to grab me if you have any questions or you want to chat.